the fact that they are buying and selling, they're purchasing inputs, they're selling products, they're exposed to, they have exposure of a transactional nature because they are buying and selling, right?
Yes.
Who remembers, because when we started the discussion on exposure, we spoke about 3 types. So transaction is one, this economic is the other one. What's the other one?
Translation.
What's economic exposure? What's economic exposure? You remember?
Yes.
Go ahead.
When the firm is affected by the unexpected change in exchange rate.
I didn't hear the first part.
When the firm is affected
When
by
the firm is affected, how? The value of the firm is affected, right?
Affected by the unanticipated change in exchange rate.
Right, good. So we are going to, we're going to look at how it is that the value of the firm is exposed, is affected, right? So when I'm finished today, when you finish this lesson, you should be able to identify how the value of the firm is affected by this economic exposure, all right?
Yes.
What are the different aspects of economic exposure, or the different types of economic exposure? And you'll be able to determine how to deal with this. How do firms, you'll understand how firms mitigate or reduce that exposure. Now, what you'll find is that with the different types of exposure, sometimes you have a little overlap, right? So when we get to translation exposure, you're going to see that some of the exposure that arises, the institution may be able to mitigate the translation exposure in the way they deal with their transactions, right? So that would reduce their translation exposure. I think we will get to translation exposure today because economic exposure is not so long, right? But what we'll do, if we don't finish translation exposure today, we will finish it up next week. Please recall that next week class will be on Zoom. Okay, so I'll post the link in Moodle, all right? And so it's going to be on Zoom. So the only excuse you can have is that electricity is off, so you don't have internet. And if you think your electricity is going to go off at home, come to 5 Islands. I know, look at the faces. Look at the faces, because some of you I have you twice on a Wednesday, and those may be the only 2 classes you have, right?
Yes.
So you really don't want to come to 5 Islands. I understand that. All right, so I will attempt to record and post the recording, but that doesn't mean that you're not supposed to show up on the Zoom session next week.
Okay.
All right? Before I get into economic exposure, I am going to be posting, I won't commit to Monday, but by Tuesday, I will be posting your take-home midterm for this class. All right?
Take home, yeah. Okay.
Okay, go back to your course outline. And anybody remembers what I said I was going to do with the midterm, with the take-home, how I was going to administer it? Yeah? I'm going to open it up for 5 days, but once you open it, you will have a limited amount of time to do it. So I'm still toying with whether I should give you 48 or 72 hours, but
72 minutes.
72. You know, that's the first thing you're going to say. 72, definitely 72.
Yeah, we need the time. It's,
You need the time?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'll do that, and it will cover everything up to, it'll cover everything including translation exposure. All right? The translation exposure question you will get is something that you would have covered. If we don't finish up translation exposure today, whatever I put in there as translation exposure, you would have covered it. All right?
Yes.
I have my questions. I have a whole, I have different questions that I can use and so on. So it's not going to take me any time to pull it together. All right? Okay. Yes, so we're talking about economic exposure. Now, we know that when companies are doing business outside of their country, that they're exposed to changes in exchange rates, right? When there are changes in exchange rates, then you have issues that arise at the country level, you have issues that arise at the firm level, all right? Now, as long as you're a multinational corporation, you're going to be exposed. Even if you're not a multinational corporation, but you are purchasing your inputs from overseas, you are going to be exposed to exchange rates. The changes in the exchange rate and risk, right? So when we talk about economic exposure, we're not just talking about multinational firms, but we're talking about all firms, all the companies here, for example, that purchase from China, that purchase from Japan, that purchase from Europe, from Panama, from Brazil. They are all exposed to economic exposure and transaction exposure. They may not be exposed to translation exposure unless they are a multinational firm. All right? So this is important for all firms. And for my budding entrepreneurs in here who won't just rely on Amazon, but may purchase from other countries because you want to do what? You want to keep your costs as low as possible. And so you may decide to purchase out of South America. All right? Because remember, always remember, the US is not the be all and end all. All right? Remember that the US companies that are making a lot of the things that we purchase, where do they manufacture their items?
China.
China, Vietnam,
Mexico,
Singapore, Thailand. All right? And so you could actually go to these countries, but to purchase whatever whatever your inputs are for your business. I'm speaking things, I'm trying to speak things into being. Because as an aside, these days, just doing your 9 to 5 is not sufficient. The way inflation is, cost of living, your 9 to 5 is not gonna give you what you would like. All right? Believe me. Or your 8 to 4:30. So you need to look at other avenues. So we should all be entrepreneurs. All right? Right. So when there are changes in exchange rates because one currency is depreciating while another is appreciating, then it has implications for manufacturers, and it has implications for retailers, it has implications for the persons purchasing, the companies purchasing from the manufacturers, right? So one example, if the US depreciates against the Japanese yen, then it's going to make US made cars more competitive and Japanese cars less so. How is that? If the US depreciates against the Japanese yen, then it will make US made cars more competitive than Japanese cars. How is that? Huh? It's going to become more affordable to everyone because when the US depreciates, the value, all right, what you pay for the vehicle in your currency is going to be less. All right? With me? All right. Similarly, for countries like ours, where our currency is pegged to the US, if the US dollar depreciates and we are purchasing outside of items outside of, if we're purchasing US items, how does the value change for us? Does the value change for us? If the US currency depreciates, I never told you what it is, but think about it. We are pegged to the US. The EC is pegged to the US. The US depreciates, right? How does that affect the value of a US item to us? Does it affect it?
Yes.
Yes? Why? How? Huh? You don't have to spend any more or any less because we are pegged to the US. We are pegged to the US. So it's made in the US, right? But we are pegged to the US. So for us, the price doesn't change. How much we put out doesn't change. For a country not pegged to the US, so let's say Jamaica, right? If the US depreciates against the yen, somebody in Jamaica who's going to purchase a vehicle directly from the US, it's going to be a little cheaper because when the US depreciates, all right, once it depreciates, you're gonna have to put out less of your currency. Except there's something going on in Jamaica where Jamaica's currency is depreciating also. Then you have a different issue. All right, so if your currency depreciates, then if your currency depreciates against another country's currency, then that country's goods are going to be more expensive for you. All right? Good? Sure? Not quite? You think so? All right. How about my friends in the back there? Sean, you good? Shema, you're writing. I don't know if you with me or not.
Yeah.
Somebody head way down there. Can I even see what it is? But I think I know it. All right. So even if, as a country, even if a company in a country does not export, the changes in exchange rates can affect the company because, well, what are the reasons for that? Think about it. It's on the screen, but don't pay attention to the screen. Even if a company does not export, changes in exchange rates can affect the company. How?
This is economics.
When we buy from across the board, whatever rate change may be more expensive for them to import, or it may be cheaper for them to import.
Right, so it's going to affect them because they may not be exporting, but they will be importing. Not only that, the value of their goods is going to be different. All right? Because if you're going between two flexible exchange rate jurisdictions, the value of the goods will be different. So too the value of your company to another country. So let's say a company in the UK wants to acquire a company in the US, right? The US dollar has depreciated. If the US dollar has depreciated, what do you think to the value of the company in the US.
It's also decrease.
The value is going to be decreased relative to what it was before, right? And so the company in the UK will look at the value of the company before, the value now, and that is going to impact its decision as to whether or not to invest in this company, all right? It may acquire it for a myriad of other reasons, all right, which we will speak to under the topic cross-border acquisitions. But the value of that company is going to be different once the currency appreciates or depreciates, all right? And so changes in the exchange rate affects the competitiveness of the company as well as its balance sheet. How does it do that? How does it affect the competitiveness versus the balance sheet? The value of the assets will be less if the value of the currency is less, right? And the value of the currency becomes less because the economy isn't doing well. So that's the economic exposure, all right? So if Antigua's economy is declining, if GDP is declining in Antigua, and it's consistently declining over a number of years, the value of Antiguan companies will be less as well, all right? Because your asset values are going to decline, all right? Now in terms of the competitiveness relates to the depreciation where the American goods are going to be more competitive because it's cheaper to purchase them. It's cheaper for a company outside to purchase those than to purchase from Japan, where Japan's currency is higher than the US currency. So it affects the competitiveness. That is how it would affect the competitiveness, right? Any questions? Now remember that what we have on the PowerPoint here, there's additional explanation in the text. This is where your textbook is going to be critical because the examples are going to help you. All right, and we're going to look at an example in a little bit. When we finish talking about economic exposure, we're going to go to the textbook and we're going to look at a little case. All right?
Okay.
So, I alluded to this earlier. There's a difference between foreign currency risk and foreign currency exposure. All right? Exposure measures what is at risk. Exposure measures what is at risk. Okay? So the exposure to currency risk is measured by different, we call it sensitivities or different factors. So first you have the future domestic currency values of a firm's assets and liabilities. So there's exposure to currency risk there because in the future the currency value is going to be different for the assets and the liabilities. So it's twofold. The exposure there is in two places. The value of the firm's assets and liabilities and the operating cash flows. Okay? So your operating cash flows, this is why you need FM1 to do this course, right? Your operating cash flows are sensitive to changes in exchange rate. So let's take a step back. What are operating cash flows? Let's go back to FM. What are operating cash flows?
Operating cash flow.
How you get the operate? Go ahead, Sharon. The money that comes in and that goes in and out of the business through its operation. So, what is the main? What is the business doing? What is the business about? So, if you're a manufacturing company, what are you operating? Let's say you're manufacturing caps. What would be your operating cash flows? What's your incoming cash flows? If you're manufacturing caps, the sales of your caps, yeah, right. So that's your operating cash inflows. And when we talk about cash flows, we generally speak about the inflows. But to get your actual, you need your net cash flows to determine the values of your operations, right? So, exposure to currency risk affects both the firm's assets and liabilities, so the value of the assets and liabilities, in other words, the value on the balance sheet, all right? And it also affects the operating cash flows, so the sales, the money is coming in, right? If a firm's assets, that is what's on the balance sheet, what are the firm's assets? What are the assets? Equipment, so you have its physical assets, but you also have liquid assets, which means what? The cash in the bank, any receivables, all right? Intangibles, yes. What are intangibles? Intellectual property, yes. What's that? Not you. When we talk about intellectual property, what are we talking about? Copyrights and so on, yes, okay. So, for example, music. When artists produce music, those are intangibles, right? And our artists lose money. How do our artists lose money on their music? When we do what?
Copyright and down.
When we stream them, download them without paying anything for them.
YouTube.
And it's something that we do all the time.
YouTube.
Right?
Sometimes it's free.
So they get royalties on that. And that is, there's an association, I don't know who's into music, I can't remember the name of the association, that is promoting the royalties on music. And so when Tiana and Claudette releases music on the internet and it is streamed, they should be getting monies on that. All right? So I use Tiana and Claudette, but you know, we don't see them. Anyways, so remember, exposure to currency risk is measured by the sensitivities of the future value of the firm's assets and liabilities, as well as the company's operating cash flows, right?
Okay.
How sensitive those operating cash flows are to changes in interest in exchange rates.
Okay.
So, if the assets are highly sensitive to changes in exchange rate, then the value of the asset is going to change right along with exchange rate. And so this is where you get, the firm is exposed to currency risk. And so the same thing applies for the operating cash flows. So what you have to do to determine how much the exposure is, you have to, there's a way to do that, all right? And we're gonna have a look at that. So asset exposure is determined using regression analysis, in which the exposure coefficient can be determined as B. What is CO? Everybody in here should have done statistics. What is COB? covariance, all right? And what is VAR? Variance,
Variance.
all right?
Alright.
So where the covariance between the dollar value of the asset and the exchange rate, and the variance is the variance in the exchange rate, your exposure coefficient is this. So it's your covariance between what? I didn't tell you what PNS is. But what you think it is? What do you think it is?
Purchases and sales. I don't know.
Huh?
Purchases and sales.
Okay. So here, this is a covariance between the dollar value of the asset and the exchange rate. All right? So P is what we're referring to as the dollar value of the asset, and S we're using S for the exchange rate.
Okay.
And then VAR, or variance S, is the variance of the exchange rate. So what that is telling you is that the exposure, right? The exposure of the asset is dependent on how the value of the dollar, the dollar value of the asset and the exchange rate, how do they, if one goes up, does the other one go down? Or if one goes up, does the other one go up? So what is the covariance? How do they work together? All right? And it's affected by the variance in the exchange rate. In other words, the changes in the exchange rate. How does the exchange rate change? So the asset exposure is the relationship between the dollar value of the asset and the exchange rate, all right? So those are the two factors that you have to consider. Now, that information is gathered over time, right? And so you can work that out. We're not working it out right now, but it's there. Now, when your operating cash flows are affected by foreign exchange movements, and we refer to it as exposure of the operating cash flows, right? Operating cash flows, we said, comes from sales, if it's a manufacturing company making things. And so when exchange rate changes, it affects the operating cash flow. So if a firm is manufacturing in the US, all right, and it's selling overseas, its operating cash flows are going to be dependent on how the US dollar is doing against the currencies in the various countries that the company sells to, right? So think about it. It's a manufacturing company, it's selling, maybe selling internally, so that part is fine. But if it is selling, if it's relying on its exports to Japan, its exports to Mexico, its exports to China, then it has to, it's exposed to currency exposure from 3 different currencies. Just think about that. All right? So when you convert, they sell them overseas. Yes, they may invoice in US dollars, right? But the competitiveness is going to be affected if the US dollar appreciates or depreciates. So the competitiveness is affected there, which will affect the volume of sales. All right? So it's a little You have to make the connections. Now, companies must try to manage this operating exposure, all right, because it can account for the biggest portion of total exposure. Why is that? Because if you're in this business where your principal income, the majority of your income is coming from your operations, which is normal for most companies, the majority of your income is coming from your operations, then your operating exposure may be the biggest portion of your total exposure if you are either selling overseas or you're importing your inputs, right? Because remember, when you import those inputs, your costs are going to go up or down depending on the value of the currency, all right? Versus the value of the currency where you are purchasing your input. So it's going to affect your cost, all right? Okay.
Got it.
So in terms of a definition for operating exposure is the extent to which the firm's operating cash flows is affected by random changes in exchange rates. All right? So the changes in exchange rates, this is why we say the changes in exchange rate affects the competitiveness of the company. And so operating cash flows may change due to two things: the competitive effect, all right? Remember the US making cars, Japan making cars, the US depreciated against the Japanese yen, the US cars are more competitive, all right? Because it takes less money, less of the foreign currency to purchase the US cars. And then you have the conversion effect, all right? When you're converting from one currency to the next. Now, any questions so far? Please, please, please don't just rely on the notes. Read the text where you get some more examples and so you can relate to it a little better, all right? Operating exposure is determined by the structure of the markets in which the firm sources its inputs and the firm's ability to mitigate the effect of exchange rate changes by adjusting its markets, product mix, and sourcing. So let's think about that. Let's think about that. All right? How many of you did operations management? Anybody did operations management? Doing it now? Doing it now? Any of just that point there sounds familiar? Kind of, you think so? How many people do operations management now? Operations and production management. Put up your hand, let me see, man.
It's different
Don't
from.
be shy. Come on, if you're afraid to ask your question. Okay, good, thank you. So I have two here. 1, 2, 3. You doing it? No. Oh. All right, so operating exposure, I'm going to go over it again, is determined by the structure of the markets in which the firm sources its inputs. When we say structure of a market, what does that mean? What does that mean? When you talk about market structure, anybody knows that? When we talk about market structure, what are we talking about? Supply chain could be one thing, but economists, when we talk about market structure,
Different free markets, is that what we're talking about?
Maybe like government.
monopolies, oligopolies.
I read free market.
Yeah, she was kind
Okay,
of right.
free
Yeah.
market, right?
How much government is involved,
How
perhaps?
much, yes, how much government involvement is there in the market, okay? And then, so that's part of it, all right? And then the firm's ability to mitigate the effects of the exchange rate. Now, it can mitigate the effect of the exchange rate by adjusting its market. So if this firm has a market, the firm is producing, it has a market, so it can adjust the market it is serving. It can decide that it's going to serve a different market, it's going to diversify its market, right? It can determine that it's going to purchase from a different type of market, all right? Product mix. Product mix. So what range of products is it selling, all right? Maybe it changes product mix because in order to produce a particular product, it has to import a lot and it exposes itself to the exchange rate risk there. Okay, in terms of product risk, it may look at products that where the certain inputs are higher because it has to import it, all right? And then of course sourcing, where you're sourcing your products from. So, this may not be the greatest example, but one of the things, in some, not in all, during COVID, the price of some things went up, price of some things went down.
Okay.
Do we know why that is? Certain products you couldn't get it from where you're accustomed to get them from. And so you source it from someplace else and it ends up being cheaper.
More expensive.
All right, it will end up being cheaper because you're not it's not the brand that you're accustomed to. So you shift you shift where you're sourcing from. So the brand may change, but the quality may be the same. It's really only, it's really only in your foods where there's the taste involved that you may say, I don't like, or I only like Kellogg's cornflakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you only like Kellogg's cornflakes because that's what you've been exposed to. Trust me,
Mm-hmm.
if you stop eating the Kellogg's cornflakes and you only buy the, what is it, Sunshine? What are some other brands?
Raisin Bran.
No, cornflakes, just say.
Okay, sorry. I'm still on that.
You've been typical West Indian.
I don't know, it's our conflicts to me.
Alberto, so you have Sunshine, you have Alberto. Essential every day, yes. Kids' choice, right. Now, believe me, if you stop eating that Kellogg's, how many people only eat Kellogg's cornflakes? Okay. How many people only eat, is it Kellogg's Fruit Loops?
Yeah.
All right. How many people only eat Kellogg's Fruit Loops?
I used to. All of it.
You eat all of it, everything Kellogg's.
I used
How
to.
many people only eat Kellogg's? The
Well,
same hand's gonna go back up, it's okay. But
not all.
Kids' Choice isn't bad. Kids' Choice isn't bad. Is it cheaper than Kellogg's? Yes, it is. And guess what? Of course, you must have. We mean, but I mean, you're always bothering me, so I have to bother you. So, but if you stop eating Kellogg's for a while, and you start eating Kids' Choice and you get accustomed to the flavor, it begins to not matter. It begins to not matter because when you put in the milk and the sugar and it all goes to mush, it begins to not matter, believe me. All right? Kellogg's is nasty. Okay. Hey. All right? So, you change your sourcing. All right? You change where you source your products from, your inputs from. All right? And sometimes in changing the sourcing, where you get your products from, it may change your products slightly. What the companies, what certain manufacturing companies tend to do though, when they do that, and this is an aside, this has nothing to do with exchange rate, the differences and the risk, but they add more chemicals to get it to where they want it to be, right?
Yes.
And that's something you can do. Okay? Many of us may not have, when you go in the supermarket and you buy, let's say spare ribs. No, let's not do spare ribs. Let's use
Serious?
diced pork.
What?
What happened? You've been here
What?
don't eat pork?
No, I don't eat pork.
Okay. Not everybody. Stick to the ribs. Okay. So
Wait, isn't that still pork?
yes. He really opposed to it. All right. That's okay. We don't eat some of the things we eat. How about that?
Okay, okay. Wow,
Right.
okay.
So a lot of the pork that we consume, it's local. All right?
Yes.
And we don't even realize it. We do not even realize it. There was a time when all of our eggs were imported. Does it make a difference in the taste? Not really. It makes a difference in the color. When you look at the local eggs, the yolks look much richer, they're more yellow. All right? So companies, I lost the train of thought. And so companies will change where they source from in order to reduce their economic exposure. Through their operations, they will change their product mix. You can change your product mix, all right, to help to reduce your exposure. If you change your product mix, though, you have to balance that with competitiveness. If you are in a particular market, you want to ensure that you remain competitive, because companies are, if you think about strategic management, the goal of strategic management is really to improve your competitiveness. All right? So companies try to adjust their operating exposure by these methods. Okay? So they look at the structure of the markets, where they source their products, and then they mitigate also by adjusting the market that they serve and making conscious decisions to serve or not serve particular markets, because it may become too expensive to serve a particular market. That happens, all right? It pushes up the cost. And then they look at product mix and sourcing. So the operating exposure is going to arise if the cost of doing business, or the cost of its inputs, or its price is sensitive to changes in exchange rates. And obviously, if the cost is sensitive to change in exchange rates, and change in exchange rates is going to carry up your cost, then it's going to also carry up your exposure, right? And then if your price is sensitive to changes in exchange rates, again, your price, if it goes up, it makes you less competitive, of course. All right? So any change in exchange rate that's going to make your price more relative to another producer or supplier is going to expose you to operating exposure. So all of that is economic, encapsulated under the economic exposure. All right? Any questions? So, this slide is really going a little deeper into how you manage, how companies manage their exposure. The first bullet really speaks to those companies that are exposed, all right, and how they are exposed. So companies that export or do cross-border sourcing, like I said earlier, where they have joint ventures as well with foreign companies, and where they have established production and sales affiliates overseas, they will have cash flows that are sensitive to exchange rate changes, right? But we said that already. And the way that companies try to stabilize their cash flows when the exchange rates fluctuate are below. So they use foreign exchange exposure management, all right, through their transaction costs, and they have to utilize strategic management, so they plan into the long term. So when they make a decision to select a low-cost production site, they look at historical information on exchange rates for that country. Labor costs may be lower. Labor cost is one of the biggest costs to manufacturers, to producers, and so this is why a lot of American companies would have established factories in Mexico, in China, and so on, right? Yeah, hand up. Okay. Right, so the way they manage the operating exposure is to select low-cost production sites. They look for flexible sourcing policy, all right? So they have a flexible sourcing policy which says we don't have to get this item from this place or the same place all the time. They look for alternative places that they can source from. So they don't just get up today and say, oh, we stopped sourcing from China, we're gonna source from Mexico. No, they look ahead and they see, they look at historical costs and all of that in a couple of jurisdictions, so they know that I can shift from here to here. All right, so during COVID, when the supply chain out of the US was an issue, our retailers source products from elsewhere. All right, so they came back to the Caribbean, and they went to South America, right? You notice that more and more, in some supermarkets more than others, the packaging, the language on the packaging is what?
Different language?
Different, okay, so some, we have Spanish, all right? Quite a bit of our products have Spanish, okay? I happen to like, there's a rice, I'm assuming it's sourced out of Santo Domingo, Campos, all right? I happen to like that. So if I see that, I'm gonna buy that before I buy whatever the other ones are called. Okay? Huh?
There's something called 3 jewels rice.
Three jewels always
They say
smell
so.
old.
I know.
And taste old.
But that's, I don't understand
I
this.
don't know what, right? So, and we look at, when we look at the packaging on a lot of what we purchase, it's no longer coming out of the US. Our companies are sourcing from Panama. Our retailers are sourcing from Panama. They source directly from China. And they source from some South American places. We get products out of Santo Domingo, because once you have the transportation, once you have that transportation, you can get your goods. Certain products come from the other Caribbean islands because they're duty free. They come from CARICOM, they're duty free, right? And so sourcing. Then you have diversified markets. Diversified markets mean you look for other markets where you can sell your products. Then of course there's product differentiation and research and development. What's product differentiation? Anybody?
We do it in marketing.
You did it in marketing, yes, and I'm sure most of you did marketing already. Those who waited won't be doing it now and couldn't get, or you tried and couldn't get in the class. How many people doing marketing now? So everybody did it already? No? How many people haven't done marketing? Next time you see it, try and get it.
Really? Yeah.
Because if you wait too long, you're gonna have a problem if it's a requirement. So yes, in marketing marketing speaks of product differentiation. So since only a few people said that they didn't do marketing, what's product differentiation?
Google.
Jane.
That's making your product more unique or different from the competitors.
Okay. What are some of the things that companies do to make their products?
The labels, the design.
Labeling is important, yes. All right. Especially products that you sell to children. All right. Make it pretty and they're happy. However, their taste is a whole other story altogether.
Sweet?
Huh?
You mean sweetness?
No, their taste. Their taste buds. Children
Okay.
like taste. My children would not eat. What is the Vienna sausage that's the only one they used to eat?
The yellow one.
No, don't give them that. No, not eating it.
You mean?
It's Libby's.
in-
Well, you could only give them that. So that was their taste. And don't give them the cheap hot dog sausages. It tastes good.
You mean the chicken sausage? Yeah.
The chicken
No,
fries.
chicken France, right? That's what I'm
Right.
trying to. Yeah.
So,
Alright.
anyways,
I
product
love those.
differentiation and research and development. To improve your product and to even reduce the cost of production, research and development is very important, right? And then, of course, the strategy that we learned last week, financial hedging. And how do we hedge? We hedge using what?
Forwards, futures,
Forwards, futures, and what else?
options,
Options.
and something
Alright,
called
good.
swaps. I don't know.
Okay, so
I don't understand them yet.
you don't understand them yet?
No.
We're going to go back to them and do them in more detail. Because what I did, I opted to do the exposure before doing the hedging. So I introduced you to it.
Okay, that's
I
all.
introduced you to hedging
Mhm.
as a way to make it a little bit more interesting. Because if I just came to you and teach you futures, leave futures. If I just came to you and taught you forwards and options without something to relate it to, in my mind, it's a little bit more difficult to grasp.
Okay.
So now that you have been introduced to it as a way to reduce exposure to a company, we'll go back and do it in a little bit more detail.
Okay.
All right?
Yes. Stress.
Because you may see it again depending on what electives you choose to do. We don't have a lot of,
Yeah.
portfolio management. Yeah, some people sound like they're trying to do that. Don't worry, we are changing those persons who
You got through.
They told me I got you, but I don't have it in my hand, yeah. Yes. So portfolio management, the weighting is 30/70. So it's a little challenging, so,
Slightly.
yes, so that should change, that should actually change, I think. It should change to 50/50, but I don't have the approval in my hand as yet, so. Those people who did it when it was 30/70, don't try to beat me off. I couldn't do anything about it then. All right, so let's do a little recap. Sorry, not recap. I want us to, so this is translation exposure. I want to have a look
Wow.
at, second.
Yeah, translation. Of course. Careful exposure, translation. Oh, right.
I had my page and everything, and it closed on me.
Back with the history.
Hmm?
History.
No, just,
Okay.
I must have accidentally come out of it. I don't like this book because it doesn't have a table of contents, so I can't just go to the page I was.
There's certain apps that can generate a table, a bookmark, like certain apps that can do that for you. So you can go to what page.
Yeah, well.
But yeah, okay. And they say they don't want anything illegal, right?
No, I don't want it to be.
Mm.
This works.
What's it called?
The internet is not my friend.
Yeah, torrent site.
Hmm?
Something called Pirate Bay. I don't know. You ever heard of Pirate Bay? Pirate Bay, right? You ever heard of Pirate Bay? Pirate Bay. No? What?
I want to hear about it.
Okay. Yes, everything.
You need a break?
Yeah, we get to the 5 minutes now.
Okay, take your 5 minutes and come back.
Hear that?
Take your 5 minutes and come back.
Yeah, it's true. When the class start? 10? Or 10:30?
10:30.
Okay.
No, it's not 10.
Okay. I get confused at time. Maybe you can type in a word and search it and.
It doesn't, I'm not able to search.
Oh my.
Because it's a PDF, it's a PDF, it's a PDF. If it
Yeah,
was an
document.
ebook, then I would be able to, but it's a PDF. So, I don't have that from your arm.
Okay.
Not your arm, but
Mhm.
students.
You just need to get an app, miss. What do you call it? A legal app. I might dark web. Is it dark web you call it? No, that's not correct.
And the internet is not working with me either.
Adobe. Is it Adobe? Add.